Tonight, we examine a case that has been called the oldest unsolved murder in the United Kingdom, a killing that has never been closed, and a verdict that left an entire county uncertain for more than a century and a half. A single afternoon in a farm kitchen, a trial that lasted 2 days, and a question that has never been answered. The case of Janet Rogers begins at Mount Stewart Farm, near the village of Forgandenny, in the county of Perthshire, Scotland, in the year 1866. Forgandenny lay in the valley of the River Earn, a stretch of lowland country given over almost entirely to arable and mixed farming, where the soil was reckoned among the most productive in the county, and the rhythms of the agricultural year governed the lives of nearly everyone who lived there. The parish was small, its population numbering only a few hundred souls, scattered across farmsteads, a handful of cottages, and the kirk that stood at its centre. In such a district, a farm's household, its tenant, its servants, and its hired hands would have been known by name and by sight to nearly every family within walking distance. Mount Stewart Farm itself was a working tenancy, one of many such holdings let out under the terms common to Perthshire agriculture, in the period in which a tenant farmer paid rent to a landowner and worked the ground with a combination of family labour and hired servants engaged under the customary terms of the season. The year 1866 fell within the reign of Queen Victoria, a period in which Scottish agriculture, though increasingly touched by mechanisation and by the expanding railway network, still relied heavily upon a labour system inherited from earlier generations. Farm servants, both those who worked the land and those who worked within the farmhouse itself, were typically engaged under fixed terms, often 6 months at a time, in a practice widely known in Scotland as the feeing system. A ploughman such as James Crichton, who by the spring of 1866 had been in the employ of the tenant of Mount Stewart Farm since the previous October, would have held his position under such an arrangement, living either within the farmhouse itself or in accommodation provided nearby, and working under the direction of the farmer who held the tenancy. The farmhouse kitchen in a household of this kind functioned as the practical centre of daily life. It was there that meals were prepared, that tools of the household, including implements such as axes kept for the splitting of firewood, were stored and used, and that much of the domestic labour of the farm was carried out. Late March in this part of Scotland marked the early weeks of the agricultural year, when ploughing began in earnest and when farming households often turned their attention to matters of staffing, seeking replacements for servants whose terms had ended or who had departed for other positions. It was against this backdrop, in a farmhouse kitchen in a quiet parish beside the River Earn, that Janet Rogers arrived to spend what would become the final days of her life. Janet Rogers was born Janet Henderson. The documented record of her early life, her parentage, and her upbringing has not survived in the sources available for this account, and no detail of her childhood, her education, or her early years can be stated with confidence. What is established is that she was the sister of William Henderson, the tenant farmer who held Mount Stewart Farm in 1866, and that by the time of her death she had married and had taken the surname Rogers. Older accounts of the case occasionally refer to her by her maiden name, Henderson, owing to her connection to her brother's household, and this has, at times, introduced confusion into the historical record, since the victim and the tenant of the farm shared a family name that was not her own by the time of the murder. Her precise marital circumstances in 1866, whether she was a widow, whether her husband was living, and if so, where he resided or what occupation he followed, are not established in the sources available for this account. The narration that follows does not assert facts on these points beyond what the record allows, and refers to her as the surviving documentation permits, as a woman named Janet Rogers, sister to the tenant of Mount Stewart Farm. By the spring of 1866, Janet Rogers was not herself resident at Mount Stewart Farm, as a matter of course. She had travelled there specifically to assist her brother, William Henderson, with the running of his household. The farm's domestic servant, whose duties would ordinarily have included the management of the kitchen and the general upkeep of the house, had left her position, and Henderson found himself without help in the domestic sphere of the farm at a time when such assistance was considered essential to the functioning of a working household. He was, according to the surviving record, in the process of seeking a replacement, and in the meantime his sister came to Mount Stewart to fill the gap. Janet Rogers arrived at the farm approximately 2 days before her death, placing her arrival at around the 28th of March, 1866. For those 2 days, she appears to have taken up the ordinary duties of a farmhouse kitchen, though the specific tasks she performed and her movements through each of those 2 days are not detailed in the sources available for this account. If you find value in histories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. This story begins in an ordinary farming household, much like countless others across lowland Scotland in the year 1866. The household at Mount Stewart Farm, in the days leading up to the 30th of March, consisted of William Henderson, the tenant farmer, his sister Janet Rogers, present to manage the domestic duties of the house, and James Crichton, the ploughman who'd been engaged on the farm since the previous October. There is no indication in the surviving record that Crichton was a recent arrival or a stranger to the household in any sense. He had worked at Mount Stewart for approximately 5 months by the time of the murder, a period consistent with half of a standard feeing term, and would have been a familiar figure to both Henderson and, in the short time she'd been present, to Janet Rogers herself. The nature of his daily duties as ploughman would have kept him largely occupied with the fields and the livestock rather than the domestic interior of the farmhouse, though as a resident farm servant he would have had regular occasion to enter the kitchen, whether for meals or for other purposes connected to the running of the farm. No documented dispute, threat, or source of tension involving Janet Rogers herself has survived in the record consulted for this account. There is no indication that she had quarrelled with anyone at the farm, that she had received threats, or that her presence at Mount Stewart was itself a matter of controversy within the household or the wider parish. She appears, so far as the surviving documentation permits any conclusion, to have been present at the farm for the ordinary and unremarkable purpose of helping her brother through a temporary shortage of domestic help. Her exact movements on the morning and early afternoon of the 30th of March, 1866, prior to the attack that ended her life, are not established with any precision in the sources available. What can be stated is that she was present in the kitchen of Mount Stewart Farm on that date, and that it was there that she was killed. The circumstances that preceded the murder, then, present a household that was, on the surface, unremarkable. A tenant farmer managing his land through the opening weeks of the agricultural season. A ploughman engaged in ordinary farm labour, established in his position for several months. A sister who had come to help run a kitchen, left short-handed by the departure of a servant. Nothing in the surviving record points to any anticipation, on the part of anyone connected with the farm, that the 30th of March would end in violence. The record that survives establishes the arrangement of the household and the ordinary nature of the days that preceded the crime, but it does not and cannot explain what altered on that particular afternoon to bring about the death of Janet Rogers. James Crichton, the ploughman later tried in connection with the murder, is not documented in the surviving sources beyond the basic facts of his occupation and his term of service at Mount Stewart Farm. His age, his place of origin, his family circumstances, and any details of his character or reputation prior to the events of March 1866 have not survived in the record available for this account, and no motive attributed to him can be stated as an established fact. He had been hired as ploughman in October of 1865 and remained in that position through the following spring, a term of employment that placed him squarely within the household at the time of the murder, but which by itself establishes nothing beyond his presence on the farm. William Henderson, the tenant of Mount Stewart Farm and brother to the victim, requires separate and careful treatment in any account of this case. Henderson was never charged with any offence in connection with his sister's death. He was not tried, and no court ever considered the question of his guilt or innocence in a formal proceeding. It must be stated plainly that the only person ever brought to trial for the murder of Janet Rogers was James Crichton. At the same time, the surviving record indicates that Henderson's own conduct in the aftermath of the killing drew the attention of investigators, and that later re-examination of the case by historians has raised questions about his account of events that were never fully resolved. Henderson was, by his own account, among the last people to see his sister alive. He reported to those investigating the crime that the house had been disturbed, or in his words ransacked, in a manner suggesting that an intruder had entered the property. This claim, according to the surviving record, did not fully accord with the observations made by those who examined the scene, whose findings suggested a state of the house inconsistent with Henderson's description. This discrepancy, together with other details of the investigation, has led to a theory, advanced in modern historical re-examination of the case, that Henderson himself may have borne some responsibility for the disorder of the scene, and that his account may have been constructed, in part or in whole, to direct suspicion elsewhere. This remains a theory rather than an established finding. No formal accusation was ever brought against him, and the record does not permit a definitive judgment on his role in the events of the 30th of March, 1866. The following accounts will address Henderson's later life, which included a documented decline in his mental health, but it will not, at any point, state or imply that he was convicted, charged, or formally accused of the murder of his sister, since the surviving record does not establish any such formal proceeding against him. On the afternoon of the 30th of March 1866, Janet Rogers was killed in the kitchen of Mount Stewart Farm by multiple blows from an axe. The attack was violent and sustained, and blood was later found to have spattered the walls and furniture of the room in which she died. The precise sequence of the assault, whether she was struck from behind or facing her attacker, and whether any struggle preceded the fatal blows, is not established in the surviving record. No witness to the attack itself has been documented in any source consulted for this account. The kitchen of a working farmhouse of this period would ordinarily have contained tools kept for household purposes, among them axes used for the splitting of firewood, implements that were common fixtures of such a room and that required no special explanation for their presence. It was with such a weapon readily at hand within the household itself that Janet Rogers met her death. The discovery of her body followed the attack, though the precise circumstances of that discovery, including the identity of the person who first found her and the exact hour at which this occurred, are not established with certainty in the sources available for this account. What is documented is that her body was found within the kitchen of Mount Stewart Farm, and that the scene presented unmistakable evidence of a violent assault. News of the killing spread quickly through the parish of Forgandenny and the surrounding district, as would be expected in a small rural community where a crime of this severity was without precedent in living memory. The authorities were notified, and an investigation was formally opened into the death of Janet Rogers, sister of the tenant of Mount Stewart Farm. The investigation that followed extended over a period of some length before any arrest was made, though the exact duration of that investigation is not established in the surviving record. Officers examined the scene of the crime, noting the condition of the kitchen, the extent of the blood staining upon the walls and furniture, and the general disposition of the room. Statements were taken from those connected with the household, including William Henderson and James Crichton, as would be the standard practice in any investigation of a suspicious death within a rural Scottish parish of this period. It was in the course of this early inquiry that the discrepancies in William Henderson's account first came to the attention of investigators. Henderson maintained that the house had been ransacked, consistent in his telling, with the presence of an intruder who had entered the property with the intention of theft and had been discovered in the act by Janet Rogers. Investigators examining the property, however, found the condition of the house difficult to reconcile with this account. The disorder Henderson described did not, according to the surviving record, match the observations made by those who inspected the scene, and this inconsistency became a point of particular attention as the inquiry proceeded. Investigators also gave consideration to certain details of the scene that suggested the involvement of someone with intimate knowledge of the household rather than a stranger acting on impulse or opportunity. Doors that would ordinarily have been left unsecured during the day were found locked. The body of Janet Rogers had, by the time investigators arrived, been covered, a detail that later analysis of the case has treated as suggestive of the presence of someone acquainted with the customary handling of a body within a household, rather than the hurried departure of an intruder fleeing discovery. A pipe was found at the scene, an object whose presence investigators noted without, so far as the surviving record indicates, being able to establish with certainty to whom it belonged or what significance, if any, it held in relation to the crime. Taken together, these details informed a line of inquiry that considered the possibility that the killing had been carried out, or its scene subsequently arranged, by someone already familiar with the household and its routines, rather than by an outsider unconnected to Mount Stewart Farm. The investigation proceeded along these lines for a considerable period before attention settled upon James Crichton as a suspect in the killing. The specific evidence that led investigators to focus upon Crichton, as opposed to any other person connected with the farm, is not detailed with precision in the sources available for this account. What is established is that Crichton was eventually taken into custody in connection with the murder, and that he was subsequently committed to stand trial. Under the procedure observed in Scotland at this period, the case would have proceeded through a process of precognition, in which the procurator fiscal, acting as the local public prosecutor, gathered statements and evidence from witnesses in advance of any trial. This process, rather than an inquest of the kind conducted in England, would have governed the preliminary stages of the case against Crichton, with the results of the precognition forming the basis upon which the matter was remitted to the High Court of Justiciary sitting on circuit at Perth. The names of the procurator fiscal and of the witnesses examined during this stage of proceedings have not survived in the sources consulted for this account. The medical examination of Janet Rogers' body was conducted in the days following her death, in keeping with standard practice for a case of violent death in this period. A physician attended to examine the body and to establish the cause of death, though the name of the examining physician has not survived in the sources available for this account. The findings of that examination, so far as they are documented, confirmed that Janet Rogers had died as a result of multiple blows from an axe, injuries that were severe and rapidly fatal. Beyond this basic finding, further particulars of the medical examination, including any estimate of the time of death or any additional observations made by the examining physician, are not established in the surviving record. The medical evidence, whatever its full extent, would in due course have been incorporated into the case prepared against James Crichton and presented before the court at Perth. The trial of James Crichton commenced at the Circuit Court of Justiciary, sitting at Perth in September of 1866, the exact date of its opening not established with certainty in the sources available for this account. The court at Perth, sitting on circuit, represented the exercise of Scotland's supreme criminal jurisdiction outside of Edinburgh, a body empowered to try the most serious offences within its circuit district, of which the murder of Janet Rogers was unquestionably one. The names of the presiding judge, the advocate depute who prosecuted the case on behalf of the Crown, and the counsel who appeared for the defence have not survived in the sources consulted for this account. The proceedings drew considerable attention from the surrounding district and from the wider Perthshire press, a killing of this violence within a settled farming parish being sufficiently rare to command public interest well beyond the immediate neighbourhood of Forgandenny. The trial extended over 2 days, during which the Crown presented its case against James Crichton. The particulars of the evidence led before the court, including the specific witnesses called and the exhibits presented, are not detailed with precision in the sources available for this account, though it may be stated that the case rested upon the findings of the investigation conducted in the preceding months, including the medical evidence establishing the cause of Janet Rogers' death and whatever testimony had been gathered concerning Crichton's presence at and connection to Mount Stewart Farm. The defence, for its part, would have been entitled under Scottish procedure to challenge the sufficiency of this evidence and to raise before the jury such doubts as the case permitted. The court proceeded through its second day toward a conclusion, the jury retiring to consider its verdict once the evidence and the closing addresses of counsel had been heard. The jury's deliberation was notably brief. According to the surviving record, the jury returned to open court after approximately 12 minutes, a period of consideration remarkably short for a capital charge tried over the course of 2 full days. Such brevity, though the record does not explain the jury's reasoning in any detail, has been widely read by those who have examined the case as an indication that the members of the jury found the evidence against Crichton unconvincing or at minimum insufficient to sustain the gravest possible verdict against him. The verdict returned was one of not proven, the third verdict available under Scottish criminal procedure, distinct from and standing apart from either guilty or not guilty. A verdict of not proven signifies that the jury has not been satisfied that guilt has been established to the standard required by law, while stopping short of the affirmative finding of innocence that a verdict of not guilty would represent. Under this verdict, James Crichton was not convicted of any offence. He faced no sentence, and by operation of law, he was released from custody following the conclusion of the trial. No further legal proceedings were brought against him or against any other individual in connection with the death of Janet Rogers. The immediate aftermath of the verdict left the case in a condition it has occupied ever since, a killing acknowledged by the courts to have occurred, an accused man neither convicted nor formally exonerated, and no other individual ever brought before a court to answer for the crime. Extensive coverage of the trial and its outcome appeared in the Perthshire press in the weeks that followed, though the specific content of that coverage and any public reaction beyond the fact of its extent is not established in detail in the sources available for this account. The case passed, in the years that followed, into the status of an unresolved matter within the criminal history of the county, its central facts, the identity of the victim, the manner and location of her death, and the acquittal by not proven of the only man ever tried, remaining fixed points of record, even as the identity of her killer remained, and remains undetermined. In the years following the trial, William Henderson continued to hold the tenancy of Mount Stewart Farm, his life proceeding, so far as the surviving record indicates, without any further formal involvement in the criminal justice process connected to his sister's death. He was never charged with any offence, and no court ever examined the theory, advanced only in later historical re-examination of the case, that he might have borne some undisclosed responsibility for the events of the 30th of March, 1866, or for the condition of the scene, as investigators found it. By 1881, some 15 years after the murder, Henderson's mental health had declined to a degree that resulted in his committal to Murray Royal Asylum in Perth. Records associated with that institution describe him at the time of his admission as suffering from acute mania. According to the account that has survived, Henderson, in the course of his illness, was reported to make statements referencing the murder of his sister and referencing as well his own apprehension in connection with the case, though the surviving record of the trial establishes clearly that Henderson himself was never formally charged or tried, and it must be stated that this particular detail of his later utterances is not fully reconciled with the documented legal history of the case in which James Crichton alone stood trial. Henderson remained institutionalised with repeated readmissions in the years that followed, and he died within the asylum on the 22nd of January 1890. The record of James Crichton's life after his acquittal has not survived in the sources available for this account. No document consulted here traces his subsequent occupation, his place of residence, or the date of his death, and nothing further can be stated of the man who stood trial for the murder of Janet Rogers and was released from the court at Perth without conviction. The absence of any further trace of him in the historical record stands in contrast to the continued documentation of William Henderson's later years, and it leaves the case with only one of its two principal figures accounted for beyond the year of the trial. The case of Mount Stewart Farm has, in the century and a half since the death of Janet Rogers, retained a place within the criminal history of Perthshire that few other local cases of the period have matched. The original records of the precognition, gathered by the Procurator Fiscal, and of the trial conducted at Perth are understood to survive within Scottish archives, and it is upon these records, together with contemporary newspaper coverage, that the modern historian Crichton drew in, producing the most complete study of the case to date, published under the title The Mount Stewart Murder, a re-examination of the United Kingdom's oldest unsolved murder case. That work, issued by a respected publisher of British historical non-fiction, undertook a systematic review of the surviving documentation, including the inconsistencies in William Henderson's account of the ransacked house, and the details of the locked doors, the covered body, and the pipe found at the scene, weighing this evidence against the case that had been presented against James Crichton at trial. The study has been credited with establishing the modern claim, now widely repeated, that the killing of Janet Rogers represents the oldest unsolved murder case in the United Kingdom, a distinction resting upon the combination of its early date, the acquittal of the only person ever tried, and the absence of any subsequent conviction in the matter. The case has also received attention beyond the printed page. A dedicated episode of the Scottish Murders podcast examined the killing of Janet Rogers and the trial of James Crichton for a modern audience, drawing upon the same body of surviving record. Regional newspapers based in Dundee have periodically revisited the case as well, publishing accounts under headlines describing it as a murder that has never been solved, keeping the case within the awareness of readers across Perthshire and the wider region of Tayside, even as the events themselves have receded further into the past. No ballad, stage play, or film is known to have been produced concerning the case, and no memorial to Janet Rogers or to the events at Mount Stewart Farm has been documented in the sources consulted for this account. The case's persistence in public memory has rested instead upon its documentary record, upon periodic journalism, and upon the modern historical study that bears its name, rather than upon any tradition of popular commemoration of the kind attached to more widely known crimes of the Victorian period. The historical significance of the case lies chiefly in the completeness of its central facts set against the permanence of its central uncertainty. The date of the killing, the location within the kitchen of Mount Stewart Farm, the method by which Janet Rogers was killed, the identity of the man tried for her murder, and the precise verdict returned by the jury at Perth are all established beyond doubt by the surviving trial record. What the record does not establish, and has never established in the years since 1866, is the identity of the person who killed her. James Crichton was tried and was not convicted. William Henderson was never charged, though questions concerning his account of events have persisted into modern historical re-examination without ever being resolved by any formal proceeding. No other suspect has ever been identified in the surviving documentation. The case remains, in the strict sense maintained by Scottish criminal procedure, neither solved nor formally closed, its central question left exactly where the jury at Perth left it after 12 minutes of deliberation in September of 1866. The parish of Forgandenny, in the years following the trial, returned to the ordinary rhythms of its agricultural life, the fields of the Erne Valley continuing to be ploughed and sown and harvested by tenant farmers and hired servants, much as they had been before the events of the 30th of March. Mount Stewart Farm itself continued as a working tenancy, its kitchen, the room in which Janet Rogers died, remaining in ordinary domestic use, as farmhouse kitchens throughout the district continued to serve the households that depended upon them. The wider currents of Victorian Scotland, the expansion of the railway, the gradual mechanisation of agricultural labour, and the growth of provincial journalism that had carried word of the trial to readers across Perthshire moved on around the case, leaving it to stand as a fixed and unresolved entry within the criminal record of the county, revisited by successive generations of local historians and, in time, by a wider audience drawn to the particular and enduring uncertainty at its centre. The verdict of not proven returned in the case of James Crichton has, in the years since 1866, become a frequently cited example within broader Scottish legal discussion of that distinctive third verdict and the particular uncertainty it leaves in its wake. Legal commentators examining the history of the not proven verdict have from time to time drawn upon the Mount Stewart case as an illustration of the verdict's practical effect, an accused man released from the dock and from any further legal jeopardy, while the public record and public memory retain neither the certainty of conviction nor the clear conscience of acquittal. This use of the case within wider legal commentary has served, alongside the work of local historians, to keep the killing of Janet Rogers within circulation as a point of reference long after the immediate community of Forgandenny had passed the events into memory rather than living experience. The physical site of Mount Stewart Farm has continued to exist as agricultural land within the parish in the years since the 19th century, the farm buildings and the surrounding fields remaining part of the working landscape of the Erne Valley. Genealogical researchers with an interest in Perthshire family history have from time to time taken up the case as a point of entry into the wider Henderson family history, tracing descendants and collateral relations connected to William Henderson and to Janet Rogers herself, work that has in some instances contributed further documentary material to the record beyond what was available to earlier chroniclers of the case. This genealogical interest reflects a pattern common to many unresolved cases of the period, in which family historians, searching parish registers and estate records for their own purposes, occasionally surface documents bearing upon a crime that has otherwise passed from official investigation into the domain of historical curiosity. The trial records held in the Scottish archives, together with the contemporary press coverage upon which later accounts of the case have drawn, are understood to include material beyond what has been recovered in the research consulted for this account, among it likely the fuller particulars of the evidence presented at Perth, the names of those who conducted the precognition, and details of the initial discovery of Janet Rogers' body that have not survived into the secondary sources examined here. The apparent completeness of the archival record, even where individual details remain unconfirmed in any given retelling, has lent the case a degree of documentary weight uncommon among rural crimes of its era, many of which survive today only in fragmentary newspaper notices, rather than in trial transcripts and precognition papers preserved across a century and a half. Within the county of Perthshire, the killing of Janet Rogers has come to occupy a place alongside a small number of other criminal cases of the Victorian period that have retained local notoriety into the present day, cases remembered less for any resolution than for the particular circumstances that left them permanently open. The case's distinction as the oldest unsolved murder in the United Kingdom A claim advanced most prominently through Chris Paton's published study rests upon a comparison with other historic unsolved killings across England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, none of which, according to that claim, carries a documented date earlier than the 30th of March 1866, while remaining, as the Mount Stewart case remains, formally unresolved in the eyes of the law. This distinction has given the case a national, rather than purely regional profile in recent decades, drawing attention from beyond Perthshire to a killing that for much of the century following the trial had been known chiefly within the county itself. The funeral of Janet Rogers followed within days of her death, in keeping with the customary practice of the period, which did not permit any extended delay between death and burial, particularly in a case where a criminal investigation was already underway and the body had already been examined by the attending physician. She was buried within the parish of Forgandenny in the kirkyard that served the small community in which her brother's farm lay, a burial ground shared, as was typical of rural Scottish parishes, by generations of the district's farming families. The specific details of the funeral service, including the minister who officiated and the number of mourners who attended, have not survived in the sources available for this account, though it may be said that a death of this violence within so small a community would ordinarily have drawn wide attendance from among the neighbouring farms and households of the parish, many of whose occupants would have known the Henderson family, and in the brief span of her stay at Mount Stewart would have come to know something of Janet Rogers herself. The hiring of farm servants such as James Crichton took place under the customary practice of the period at fixed gatherings known across lowland Scotland as feeing markets or hiring fairs, held twice yearly in towns such as Perth to coincide with the beginning of each 6-month term of service. It was at such a gathering, most likely in the autumn of 1865, that Crichton would have presented himself before farmers seeking to engage a ploughman for the coming term, agreeing upon a wage and conditions of service before travelling to take up his position at Mount Stewart Farm. This system, by which farm servants moved between employers at fixed intervals rather than remaining attached to a single household across years, meant that a farm's complement of hired labour could change substantially from one term to the next, and that a servant's tenure at a given farm, however routine it might have appeared, represented in every case a fresh arrangement entered into only months before. Crichton's 5 months of service at Mount Stewart by the time of the murder placed him roughly at the midpoint of the term he had agreed to at the previous autumn's hiring, with a further period of service still to run before the next such gathering would have offered him, or the farm, the opportunity to alter the arrangement. The wages and conditions attached to such positions varied according to the district and the particular terms negotiated at the fair, but a ploughman's feeing typically included, in addition to a cash wage paid at the end of the term, an allowance of oatmeal and other provisions, and in many cases accommodation provided either within the farmhouse itself or in a separate bothy maintained for unmarried farm servants. The precise terms of Crichton's engagement at Mount Stewart, including his wage and the nature of his accommodation, are not established in the sources available for this account, though the general practice of the district makes it probable that he lived in close proximity to the farmhouse itself, a circumstance consistent with his ready presence in the household on the day of the murder and with the investigation's early attention to those most familiar with the domestic routine of Mount Stewart Farm. The feeing markets held at Perth in the autumn and spring of each year drew farm servants and farmers alike from across the surrounding countryside, men and women walking or travelling by cart from outlying parishes such as Forgandenny to stand in the marketplace and negotiate terms for the coming half-year. A ploughman of Crichton's standing might, in the district and period in question, have commanded a wage in the region of £10 to £12 for a 6-month term, paid at the term's conclusion rather than in regular instalments, together with an allowance of meal, generally oatmeal reckoned by the peck or the bowl according to local custom, sufficient to provision a single man through the months of his engagement. Such wages were modest by the standards of urban employment developing elsewhere in Scotland during this period, yet they were sufficient to sustain the unmarried farm servant who lived, as Crichton is likely to have lived, within the shelter and provisioning of the farm itself, his food and lodging forming as substantial a part of his compensation as the cash paid to him at term's end. The bothy system, under which unmarried ploughmen and other male farm servants were housed in separate quarters, apart from the farmhouse proper, was common across many parts of lowland Scotland by the 1860s, though practice varied by estate and by individual farmer, and on smaller tenancies such as Mount Stewart, it was not unusual for a single hired ploughman to be accommodated within the farmhouse itself, taking his meals with the farmer's own household rather than in separate bothy quarters. Whether Crichton's arrangement at Mount Stewart followed this pattern of close accommodation within Henderson's own house, or whether he occupied separate quarters nearby, is not established with certainty in the surviving record, though the ease of his documented presence within the household on the day of the murder is consistent with an arrangement of close proximity rather than distant lodging. A ploughman under either arrangement would have risen before dawn to attend to the horses and to prepare for the day's work in the fields, a routine that in late March, with ploughing underway, would have occupied the greater part of the daylight hours, leaving the earlier morning and the hours around midday as the times at which his presence, within or near the farmhouse itself, would have been most likely. The rhythm of a Perthshire farm in the last days of March followed a pattern well understood by every household in the parish. The horses led out at first light, the ploughing pressed forward while the ground remained workable, and the midday meal taken within the farmhouse kitchen by whichever members of the household and its hired servants were present at that hour. It was into this ordinary and closely observed pattern of daily labour that the events of the 30th of March intruded, a single afternoon within an otherwise unremarkable term of service, disrupting a routine that had, in the 5 months since Crichton's hiring, given no occasion for any suspicion or alarm within the household at Mount Stewart Farm. The Perthshire press of 1866 operated within a provincial newspaper landscape typical of Scotland at the time. Weekly and twice-weekly papers serving the county town and its surrounding district. Their columns given over, in large part to reports of the courts, the markets, and the affairs of the agricultural community that formed the greater part of their readership. A trial of the gravity of Crichton's, heard before the Circuit Court of Justiciary at Perth itself, would have been reported at length in such papers. Their correspondents present in the courtroom to record the proceedings for readers across the county who had followed the case since the earliest reports of the killing at Mount Stewart Farm. The verdict, when it came, would have been set in type within days and carried into farmhouses and cottages throughout Perthshire, including, in all likelihood, into the parish of Forgandenny itself, where the outcome of the trial concerned neighbours of the Henderson family as directly as it concerned the wider county. The manner in which such a verdict was received by a rural readership accustomed to the more familiar outcomes of guilty or not guilty can only be inferred from the general character of provincial press coverage in this period, which tended towards sober and factual reporting of court proceedings rather than editorial comment upon jury reasoning. Papers of the district would have recorded the fact of the not proven verdict, the brevity of the jury's deliberation, and the consequent release of the accused without, so far as the surviving secondary sources indicate, offering their readers any resolution beyond what the court itself had provided. For a community the size of Forgandenny parish, in which the Henderson family and the farm at Mount Stewart were known quantities rather than distant names in a newspaper column, the verdict would have carried a particular and lasting weight, an official conclusion to the legal proceedings that nonetheless left every practical question about the events of the 30th of March, exactly where they had stood since the discovery of Janet Rogers's body. The county of Perthshire, in the decades that followed, absorbed the case into its store of local memory in the manner common to rural districts. Confronted with an unresolved crime of unusual gravity, the facts retold from time to time among those who recalled the events or had heard them recounted by an earlier generation, the details gradually settling into the fixed and familiar shape that oral tradition imposes upon such stories, even as the documentary record itself remained unchanged. It was this combination, a fixed documentary record preserved in the archives at Perth, and a persistent local memory carried forward through successive generations of the parish, that would in time furnish the material from which later historians, working more than a century after the event, were able to reconstruct the case in the detail that modern accounts now provide. The rarity of a killing of this violence within rural Perthshire in 1866 further explains the depth of attention the case received in its own time. Scotland's rural counties in the mid-Victorian period recorded comparatively few instances of murder in proportion to their population, violent crime of this severity being far more commonly associated in the public imagination and in the statistics compiled by the authorities of the period with the growing industrial towns of the central belt than with the settled farming parishes of counties such as Perthshire. A killing within a farmhouse kitchen, carried out with a household implement and involving no external intruder identifiable to investigators, stood outside the ordinary experience of a district accustomed to disputes over rent, boundaries, and the terms of tenancy rather than to violent death. It was this very rarity that lent the case its lasting hold upon the memory of the county, a single, isolated act of extreme violence set against the otherwise unbroken pattern of agricultural life along the Erne Valley. The Kirk session of the parish, the body of elders responsible under the Church of Scotland for the pastoral oversight of the community, would in the ordinary course of events have taken note of a death of this kind occurring among its parishioners, though no specific record of any Kirk session proceedings relating to the case has survived in the sources consulted for this account. The minister of the parish, whose duties would have included the burial of Janet Rogers and the pastoral care of the Henderson family in the aftermath of her death, is not named in any source available for this account, and the content of any sermon or public address he may have delivered concerning the killing has not survived. What can be said is that the ordinary institutions of a small Scottish parish, its kirk, its session, and its minister, would have stood alongside the formal machinery of investigation and trial as sources of support and interpretation for a community confronted with a crime that fell so far outside its usual experience. The case's documentary trail, running from the initial reports of the killing through the precognition process, the 2 days of trial at Perth, and the extensive press coverage that followed the verdict, together constitutes a body of surviving record unusually complete for a rural crime of its period, even allowing for the specific gaps, the names of officials, the detailed evidence, and the precise hour of discovery that remain unfilled in the secondary accounts available today. It is this combination of a substantially preserved documentary record and a permanently unresolved central question that has allowed the case to be examined and re-examined across more than a century and a half, each generation of researchers working from the same fixed set of archival materials in pursuit of an answer that the record itself has never supplied. The estate to which Mount Stewart Farm belonged and the landowner from whom William Henderson held his tenancy are not identified by name in the sources available for this account, though the general structure of landholding across lowland Perthshire in this period followed a pattern common to Scottish agriculture, in which large estates, often held by titled or long-established landed families, were divided into individual farms let to tenant farmers, under leases running typically for a period of 19 years, the standard term recognised in Scottish agricultural practice of the 19th century. Under such an arrangement, Henderson would have paid an annual rent to the estate, fixed at the commencement of his lease and reviewed only at its renewal, in exchange for the right to work the land of Mount Stewart Farm and to retain the produce of his labour beyond that rent. The 19-year lease term meant that a tenant such as Henderson could reasonably expect a long and stable occupancy of a given farm, so long as the rent was met and the terms of the lease observed, a stability that stood in some contrast to the far shorter 6-month engagements under which servants such as Crichton were themselves hired. The rent obligations attached to a farm of the size and quality of Mount Stewart would have represented a significant annual outlay for a tenant of Henderson's position, met from the proceeds of the farm's grain, livestock, and other produce sold at market in Perth, or in the smaller trading centres of the district. A poor harvest, a decline in livestock prices, or any disruption to the ordinary operation of the farm could place a tenant's position under considerable strain, though no evidence in the surviving record suggests that Henderson's tenancy at Mount Stewart was under any particular financial difficulty at the time of his sister's death. The farm continued in his occupation for years afterward, a continuity that indicates, so far as the record permits any inference, that whatever difficulties the household faced in the aftermath of the killing, they did not extend to the loss of the tenancy itself. The wider estate structure of the district also meant that the factor, the individual appointed by the landowner to manage the estate's affairs and to oversee its tenant farmers, would have stood as an intermediary figure of some local importance, responsible for collecting rents, adjudicating disputes between tenants, and representing the interests of the estate in matters touching its farms. Whether the factor for the estate that included Mount Stewart Farm played any role in the aftermath of the murder, in supporting the Henderson household, or in liaising with the authorities conducting the investigation, is not established in the sources available for this account, though such a role would have been consistent with the ordinary responsibilities such an office carried within the rural administration of a Perthshire estate in this period. No arrest was ever made. The investigation was formally closed. The case remains open. The record remains incomplete. That is where the record of the first case closes. We turn now to a second case, smaller in scope than the first and far less remembered, drawn from an earlier year and a different corner of London, where a working woman's ordinary morning routine ended in violence that was never resolved by any court. The record here is thinner than in the case just examined, but what survives is precise, and it begins, as before, with a name, a place, and a date. The case of Eliza Davis begins at the King's Arms. Wine vaults on Brook Street, off Frederick Street, in the vicinity of the Hampstead Road, in the spring of 1837, weeks before a young queen would take the throne. London in the spring of 1837 was a city of more than 1.5 million residents, the largest in the world, and one still expanding rapidly beyond its older boundaries. The area around the Hampstead Road, on the northern edge of the built city, sat close to Regent's Park, a stretch of parkland that had itself only been laid out in the preceding decades, and was still, by the standards of the day, a comparatively recent addition to the map of London. The streets in this district were a mixture of terraced housing, small trades, and public houses serving the local population, many of whom worked in trades connected to building, carting, and domestic service. Brook Street and Frederick Street were unremarkable thoroughfares of this kind, neither fashionable nor notably poor, home to shopkeepers, publicans, and the working households that supplied and served them. The Metropolitan Police, which would come to investigate this case, had been established only 8 years earlier, in 1829. It remained in 1837 a young institution, still developing its methods and its standing among the public it served. There was as yet no dedicated detective branch within the force. That would not come into existence until 1842. Investigations of serious crime in this period were carried out by uniformed inspectors and constables working in a manner that combined elements of patrol duty with the beginnings of the investigative practice that would later be formalised. It was into this early and still forming system of policing that the case of Eliza Davis would fall. A public house of this era, described in the surviving record as a wine vault, would typically comprise a tap room for customers, a cellar for the storage and preparation of drink, and living quarters for the proprietor and staff, who very often resided on the premises. Such establishments opened early, to serve labourers and tradesmen beginning their working day, and the task of unlocking the premises each morning fell, in many households of this kind, to a trusted member of staff rather than to the proprietor personally. It was this task, ordinary and repeated each day of the working year, that brought Eliza Davis to the door of the King's Arms on the morning of the 9th of May, 1837. Eliza Davis was 21 years of age at the time of her death. She was Welsh by birth, though the specific town or county of her origin is not established in the surviving record, and nothing further is documented of her parents, her siblings, or her early life prior to her arrival in London. She had been in service at the King's Arms for a period of 7 or 8 years under the establishment's previous proprietor, and had continued in that service for a further 6 months under the landlord who held the premises at the time of her death. This length of service placed her among the most established members of staff at the wine vaults, a woman who had spent the greater part of her adult life within the same walls, known to the regular custom of the house, and trusted with its daily operation. She is described in the surviving record as having been much esteemed for her civility, the only characterization of her personal manner that has come down through the sources available for this account. No record survives to confirm whether she was married or unmarried, though her position as a live-in barmaid and the absence of any reference to a husband in connection with her death suggest she was unmarried at the time, a point that should be understood as an inference from the available record rather than an established fact. By the spring of 1837, Eliza Davis occupied a position of some trust within the household of the King's Arms. She held keys to the premises. She was responsible, as a matter of daily routine, for rising ahead of the establishment's opening hours and preparing the taproom and cellar for the day's business. This was not a task assigned to a new or untested employee. It was the kind of responsibility given to a servant whose reliability had been proven over years of service, and it placed Eliza Davis each morning in a position of some solitude within the building before the arrival of other staff or customers. The publican who employed her at the time of her death later gave an account, preserved in the surviving record, of a customer who had developed the habit of arriving at the premises at around 6 o'clock in the morning, a detail that would become a point of interest once the investigation into her death began. Public houses of this district and period frequently kept a small body of such early custom, men whose trades required them to be about before the general population, and a barmaid such as Eliza Davis would have known these regular early arrivals by sight and by name over the course of years spent behind the same counter. Whether this particular early customer bore any relation to the events that followed is a matter the surviving record does not resolve, and the investigation itself would ultimately fail to establish his identity with certainty. There is a further detail preserved in the record concerning Eliza Davis's dealings with the custom of the house, though it must be treated with caution. It was reported in the course of the investigation that followed her death that a customer described as a French modeller, whose surname was given in some accounts as Entre, had on a prior occasion been refused an extension of credit for liquor by Eliza Davis, and had been heard to say, in consequence, that he would do for her. This allegation formed one strand of the investigation that followed the murder, and it will be examined in fuller detail when that investigation is described. It should be understood at the outset, however, that this account rests on report rather than on any confirmed record of the exchange itself, and that a subsequent official notice would directly contradict the theory that grew out of it. The surviving sources do not allow this allegation to be treated as an established fact of Eliza Davis's circumstances, only as a claim that entered the investigation and was never conclusively resolved. Nothing in the available record indicates that Eliza Davis had recently experienced any dispute, threat, or source of personal distress beyond the reported exchange with the French modeller. She continued, in the weeks and days before her death, to carry out the same duties she'd carried out for years, rising each morning to open the premises, serving the custom of the house, and living within its walls as she had done for the greater part of a decade. The record preserves no letters, no testimony from family, and no account of her state of mind in the days preceding the 9th of May. What can be said on the basis of what survives is that she rose that morning as she had risen on countless mornings before it, took up the keys of the house, and went down to unlock the premises for the day. The case of Eliza Davis, as it survives in the historical record, is not one that produced a lengthy paper trail of correspondence, diaries, or family testimony. What survives is chiefly procedural: the account of her death, the record of the investigation that followed, and a single reward notice issued in its immediate aftermath. This account draws on those surviving sources, on the records maintained by historians of the early Metropolitan Police, and on the compiled local histories of the streets in which the King's Arms once stood. Where the record is silent on a matter, this account will say so plainly, rather than supply an answer the sources do not provide. The morning of the 9th of May 1837 began, so far as the record establishes, in the ordinary manner. Eliza Davis rose at approximately 6 o'clock, in keeping with her established routine, and took up the keys to the King's Arms. She proceeded, as she had proceeded on countless previous mornings, to unlock the premises in preparation for the day's business. This was a task she had performed for years, requiring her to move through the building alone, ahead of the arrival of other staff, at an hour when the surrounding streets were still largely quiet. The record does not establish precisely how much time elapsed between her rising and the moment at which she was attacked, nor does it establish the exact location within the building where the attack occurred. What the surviving record does establish is the cause of her death. Eliza Davis's throat was cut. This fact is recorded consistently across the sources available for this account, though no formal post-mortem report or the name of an examining physician has been located in the course of this research, a gap in the documentary record that this account does not attempt to fill with invention. The absence of such detail should be understood as a limitation of what survives, not as an indication that no such examination took place. In a case of this severity in 1837, a medical examination of the body would have been a standard and expected part of the process that followed discovery, even where the specific findings of that examination have not survived in the sources consulted here. The discovery of Eliza Davis's body is attributed, in one of the sources consulted for this account, to a potboy employed at the premises, recorded under the surname Jones. This detail rests on a single source and has not been corroborated elsewhere, and it is presented here with that qualification. According to this account, a large quantity of blood was found at the scene, consistent with the nature of the injury that had been inflicted. Beyond this, the surviving record does not describe the physical state of the premises in further detail, nor does it establish whether there were signs of a struggle, or whether anything within the building had been disturbed or taken. No witnesses to the attack itself are documented in any source consulted for this account. The discovery of a woman dead by violence within a public house on a residential street in the early hours of a spring morning would have represented a serious and alarming event for the household and the surrounding neighbourhood. The King's Arms was a working establishment, known to its regular custom, and its barmaid a woman of years of standing within it. Her death, in the manner in which it occurred, brought the case swiftly to the attention of the police, and it is to the investigation that followed that this account now turns. The investigation into the death of Eliza Davis was conducted by Inspector Aggs of the Metropolitan Police, assisted by Police Constable Pegler. This was, as noted, an early investigation for the young force, undertaken some years before the establishment of a dedicated detective branch, and it fell to officers such as Aggs and Pegler to combine the duties of ordinary policing with the investigative work that a case of this seriousness required. Constable Pegler is recorded as having previously assisted in the pursuit of James Greenacre, a separate and unrelated case that had drawn considerable public attention in London in the preceding year, and this prior involvement appears to have been regarded within the surviving accounts as a mark of Pegler's suitability for the task now before him. It should be understood plainly that the Greenacre case bears no connection to the death of Eliza Davis beyond this shared officer, and the two matters are not to be conflated. The investigation proceeded along more than one line of inquiry. Statements were taken from those connected with the King's Arms, including the publican who employed Eliza Davis, and from members of the surrounding neighbourhood who might have observed activity around the premises in the early hours of the 9th of May. The publican's account of the customer who habitually arrived at the premises around 6 o'clock became a matter of particular interest to the investigating officers, though the surviving record does not establish that this individual was ever formally identified or questioned in connection with the case. Officers were dispatched to trace and interview persons who might have had contact with Eliza Davis or with the premises in the period leading up to her death, in keeping with the standard practice of the day. The French modeller referred to in the surviving accounts as Entre was traced in the course of these inquiries and became for a time the principal subject of the investigation's suspicion. His trade placed him among the itinerant craftsmen who moved through this part of London, taking lodgings for weeks or months at a time near their work, and his presence at the King's Arms as a customer was not in itself unusual. It was the alleged exchange over refused credit, and the words reportedly spoken in consequence, that drew the attention of the investigating officers toward him. Officers sought to establish his movements on the morning of the 9th of May, and to determine whether he could account for his whereabouts at the hour the attack was believed to have occurred. The surviving record does not preserve the details of what, if anything, he told the officers who questioned him, nor does it establish that he was ever detained or formally charged in connection with the case. 3 days after the murder, on the 12th of May, 1837, a reward notice was issued in connection with the case, offering payment for information leading to the identification and apprehension of the person responsible. This notice contained a detail that has been preserved with some precision in the surviving record, and which bears directly on the suspicion that had gathered around the French modeller. The notice stated that the man wanted in connection with the murder was no foreigner, as had been stated in some of the newspapers of the day. This was an official correction issued by those responsible for the investigation of a rumour that had evidently begun to circulate in the press in the days immediately following the discovery of the body. It stands as a rare instance in a case of this age where the investigating authority is recorded as having intervened in a public and specific manner to contradict a theory of the crime that was gaining currency outside the investigation itself. The publication of newspapers reporting a foreign suspect, followed within days by an official notice explicitly denying that the wanted man was a foreigner, indicates that the case had already attracted a degree of public attention and speculation in the immediate aftermath of the murder. Sensational crime of this kind, occurring within a public house in a settled residential district, was the subject of considerable interest among the London press of the period, and reports of violent death were commonly reproduced and embellished as they passed from one publication to another. The reward notice's correction suggests that the investigating officers regarded the circulating rumour as sufficiently damaging or sufficiently inaccurate to warrant a direct public response, a decision that in itself speaks to the seriousness with which the case was being pursued in its earliest days. The identity of the man actually wanted if this could be established with the specificity the notice implies, is not preserved in the sources available for this account. The reward notice's language indicates that the investigating officers believed, at the time of its issue, that they had formed some view of who the guilty party might be, sufficient to rule out the possibility that he was a foreign national. Yet this belief did not translate into an identification that survives in the historical record, nor did it lead to an arrest. The gap between the confidence implied by the notice and the ultimate absence of any charge is one of the more striking features of the case as it has come down through the available sources. Officers continued to trace and interview persons connected with the King's Arms and its surrounding neighbourhood in the weeks that followed the issue of the reward notice. Numerous individuals are recorded in general terms as having been traced and examined in the course of the investigation, though the specific number and identity of those questioned is not preserved with precision in the sources consulted for this account. This pattern of a wide net cast across the local population in the absence of a single confirmed suspect was consistent with the investigative practice of the period, in which officers relied heavily on local knowledge, the statements of neighbours and customers, and the tracing of anyone whose movements or reputation gave cause for suspicion. The premises of the King's Arms itself would have remained a site of ordinary business obligation, even as the investigation proceeded around it. A public house of this size and standing could not simply cease trading in the aftermath of a death on its premises, and the surviving record gives no indication that it did so for any extended period. The proprietor, who had employed Eliza Davis for 6 months, and who had given the accounts of the early morning customer that so interested the investigating officers, would have continued to operate the establishment through the course of the inquiry, his household diminished by the loss of a servant of many years' standing, and his business now associated, in the public mind, with a killing that remained unresolved. A coroner's inquest would, in the ordinary course of English legal procedure of this period, have been convened to inquire formally into the circumstances of Eliza Davis's death. Such an inquest would have been held before a coroner, with a jury of local men sworn to examine the evidence and return a verdict as to the cause and manner of death. The specific date of this inquest, the name of the presiding coroner, and the precise wording of the verdict returned are not preserved in the sources available for this account. It may be said with confidence, given the standard procedure of the day and the absence of any surviving record to the contrary, that any such verdict would most likely have taken the customary form applied in cases of unresolved violent death, that of wilful murder by some person or persons unknown. This form of words was the standard formula employed by coroners' juries throughout the period in cases where a death by violence was established but no individual could be named as responsible, and its likely use here should be understood as an inference drawn from common practice rather than a fact confirmed by any surviving transcript of the proceedings. No physician's name and no formal post-mortem report has been located among the sources consulted for this account, a gap that stands alongside the missing inquest record as one of the more significant limitations in what survives of this case. It is consistent with practice of the period that a surgeon or medical man attached to the parish or engaged by the coroner would have examined Eliza Davis's body prior to any inquest proceeding in order to establish and attest the cause of death for the purposes of the jury's verdict. Such an examination would ordinarily have been brief by later standards, conducted without the forensic techniques that would develop over the following decades, and concerned chiefly with confirming that the wound to the throat was the cause of death, and that it could not plausibly have been self-inflicted. Whatever findings such an examination produced have not survived in any source located for this account. The absence of a surviving trial record follows directly from the fact that no suspect was ever formally charged in connection with Eliza Davis's death. The investigation conducted by Inspector Aggs and Constable Pegler, for all the effort represented in the tracing of numerous individuals, The questioning of the French modèle entrée and the issuing of a reward notice within days of the murder did not produce sufficient evidence to bring any person before a magistrate for committal, still less before a judge and jury at the assizes or at the Old Bailey. The case, so far as the surviving record establishes, proceeded no further than the investigative stage. No committal proceedings are documented, no trial took place, no defendant was ever named in a court of law in connection with the death of Eliza Davis. The absence of a resolution did not mean the absence of continued effort in the days and weeks immediately following the murder. The reward notice of the 12th of May stood as a public instrument intended to draw forward witnesses or informants whose knowledge might yet break the case open, and notices of this kind were commonly kept before the public eye for a period of weeks through repeated publication and posting in the vicinity of the crime. Whether any information was ever furnished in response to the notice, and whether any such information was judged credible by the investigating officers, is not recorded in the sources consulted for this account. What is clear is that whatever leads were pursued in this period did not culminate in an identification that the authorities were prepared to bring before a court. A broadside recounting the murder was printed and sold in the streets of London in the days following the discovery of the body, in keeping with the common practice of the period, whereby printers produced cheap news sheets covering crimes of local and public interest for sale to a wide readership. Such broadsides were typically sold by hawkers for a penny or less, often within hours of a notable crime becoming known, and their language tended toward the sensational, aimed at a public with a considerable appetite for accounts of violent death. A copy of the broadside concerning the death of Eliza Davis has survived and is held today among the collections of the London Museum, a physical artefact of the case that predates and stands independent of the later specialist accounts, on which much of this record depends. Its survival across nearly 2 centuries offers a tangible link to the case, as it was understood and consumed by contemporaries in the immediate aftermath of the murder, at a moment when the investigation was still active and the outcome still uncertain. Beyond this broadside, the case of Eliza Davis did not pass into the wider currents of British cultural memory in the manner of the more notorious crimes of the era. It produced no ballad that has been traced to later collections, no dramatic adaptation, and no book-length study devoted to its circumstances. It is documented today chiefly in the specialist literature of London police history, in accounts maintained by historians concerned with the early years of the Metropolitan Police, and in compilations of London street history that record the crimes once associated with particular thoroughfares of the city. This is not a case that achieved the enduring notoriety of the era's most infamous murders. It is, instead, a case that has been preserved largely through the diligence of those with a specific interest in the early institutional history of London policing, rather than through any place it secured in popular memory at the time or since. The chief significance the case holds for later historians lies precisely in this institutional dimension. The involvement of Inspector Aggs and Constable Pegler situates the investigation within the first decade of the Metropolitan Police's existence, a period in which the methods later associated with detective work were only beginning to take shape, and in which no dedicated branch yet existed to carry out such investigations. Pegler's prior association with the pursuit of James Greenacre placed him at the time of the Davis investigation among the more experienced officers available to be assigned to a case of this seriousness, and the pairing of an inspector with a constable of proven capability reflects the still developing practice by which the young force allocated its resources to major inquiries. The case stands within this narrower field of interest as one example among several from the period through which historians have traced the earliest evolution of organised criminal investigation in London, well in advance of the formal establishment of a detective branch in 1842. The King's Arms itself, as a working public house on a residential street near the Hampstead Road, represented an entirely ordinary feature of the London in which it stood, one of a great many such establishments serving the daily needs of a rapidly growing city. Its brief prominence in 1837 arose entirely from the violence visited upon the woman who had served behind its counter for the better part of a decade, and from nothing else particular to the premises or its ordinary trade. The streets of Brook Street and Frederick Street continued, in the years that followed, to be built up and altered as this part of London expanded further, and the specific building in which Eliza Davis lived and died has not been identified as surviving into the modern era. The position occupied by Eliza Davis within the household of the King's Arms was one shared by a great many women in London's public houses during this period, women who lived under the roof of their employer, whose labour extended from the earliest hour of the morning until the establishment closed for the night, and whose trustworthiness was measured, year upon year, by the steady discharge of duties such as the keeping of keys and the opening of the premises. 7 or 8 years in such a position, followed by a further term under a new proprietor, represented an unusually long tenure, and it placed Eliza Davis in a category distinct from the more transient serving staff who moved frequently between establishments in search of better wages or conditions. Her continuity of service through a change of ownership suggests that she'd made herself, over the years, indispensable to the running of the house, sufficiently trusted by a new landlord to be retained in her position and to continue in the same duties she had carried out under his predecessor. The spring of 1837 found London in a period of transition on a national scale, with the reign of William IV drawing to its close and the accession of his niece only weeks away. Though nothing in the surviving record suggests that this wider political moment bore any direct relation to the events at the King's Arms. The ordinary business of the city continued regardless of the change in monarch soon to come, and the death of a barmaid in a public house on the northern edge of the built city was, in the context of that ordinary business, a local tragedy investigated by local officers rather than an event of national political consequence. It is worth noting, for the purposes of this account, that unresolved deaths by violence were not uncommon in London during this period, given the limitations of an investigative apparatus still in its infancy, and that the failure to identify a suspect in the death of Eliza Davis, however disappointing to those who pursued the case, was not without precedent among the crimes recorded in London during these years. The record does not preserve any account of what became of the King's Arms in the years following the murder, nor does it establish whether the publican who had employed Eliza Davis continued in the licensed trade at that address for any extended period afterward. The premises, like countless other public houses of the era, would in time have passed through further changes of ownership, further alterations to the surrounding streets, and eventually, as this part of London was redeveloped across the decades that followed, into a form the original building would not have retained. What remains fixed across all these subsequent changes to the streets and to the trade once carried on within them is the record of the 9th of May, 1837, and the woman whose ordinary morning task of unlocking a door brought her life to its end. Where a suspect was believed to have fled the immediate vicinity of a crime, standard practice among the police of this period extended the search to the wharves and points of departure from which a man might leave the country entirely, and it is consistent with such practice that inquiries connected with the death of Eliza Davis would have reached beyond the streets immediately surrounding the King's Arms to the river and its shipping. London in 1837 remained one of the busiest ports in the world, its docks receiving and dispatching vessels bound for every part of Europe and beyond, and a man wishing to leave the country quickly, whether guilty of any crime or merely fearful of being questioned in connection with one, had ample opportunity to do so amid the constant traffic of the river. Whether such inquiries were in fact made in connection with the French modeler Entree or with any other individual traced during the investigation is not established in the sources available for this account, though the reward notices, specific and public denial, that the wanted man was a foreigner, suggest that the question of whether the suspect might attempt to leave the country had, at minimum, occurred to those directing the inquiry. The tracing of individuals connected with a crime of this kind, in a district as populous as the streets surrounding the Hampstead Road, required the sustained attention of officers over a period of days and weeks rather than hours. Constables would have gone from house to house and from shop to shop in the immediate vicinity of the King's Arms, asking after strangers seen in the area on the morning of the 9th of May, after any unusual sounds or disturbances noted by neighbours before the household rose for the day, and after anyone known to bear a grievance against the establishment or its staff. This kind of canvass, laborious and dependent entirely on the willingness of residents to come forward with what they had seen or heard, formed the backbone of criminal investigation in London before the development of the forensic and detective methods that later decades would bring, and it was through such methods, rather than any single decisive piece of evidence, that the numerous individuals traced in connection with the Davis case would have come to the attention of Inspector Aggs and his fellow officers. The reward notice of the 12th of May, in offering payment for information, relied on precisely this pattern of local knowledge, on the likelihood that someone among the tradesmen, neighbours, or customers of the King's Arms possessed some fragment of information that had not yet reached the ears of the investigating officers, and that the promise of payment might induce them to come forward where a sense of civic duty alone had not. Notices of this kind were customarily posted in the immediate vicinity of the crime, printed and circulated to public houses, shops, and other places where they would be seen by the very population most likely to hold relevant knowledge, and their language was typically direct, stating the nature of the crime, the date and place of its occurrence, and the sum offered for information leading to a conviction. That the specific sum offered in connection with the death of Eliza Davis has not survived in the sources consulted for this account is a further instance of the documentary gaps that characterise this case, though the practice of offering such rewards was itself a well-established feature of criminal investigation in London throughout this period, employed in cases both resolved and unresolved. As the weeks following the 9th of May gave way to a second month, and then a third, the pattern common to unresolved investigations of this period began to assert itself. Fresh leads, if any, continued to arrive in response to the reward notice, did not survive in a form the historical record has preserved, and the intense initial activity of interviews, canvassing, and the pursuit of individual suspects, such as the French modeler Entree, appears to have given way, in the absence of any decisive discovery, to a slower and more sporadic continuation of the inquiry. This was the customary trajectory of cases that did not yield an early arrest in this period of policing, when the resources of a still young force were finite and were required elsewhere as new offences arose across the expanding city. Inspector Aggs and Constable Pegler, whatever further time they devoted to the case beyond its opening weeks, left no further correspondence or report in the sources available for this account describing the investigation's later course. The Metropolitan Police of this era maintained written records of its major inquiries, submitted through the chain of command to the force's central administration, though the survival of such records from an individual case of 1837 into the present day cannot be assumed, and no primary case file for the death of Eliza Davis has been directly consulted in the preparation of this account. What is known of the investigation's procedure, its personnel, and its principal lines of inquiry has reached later historians instead, through secondary compilations of early police history, through the surviving broadside, and through the reward notice's own text rather than through an intact original file of the kind that later Victorian and 20th century investigations would more routinely preserve. This is itself a reflection of the era in which the case occurred, a period before the systematic retention of investigative papers had become standard practice within the force, when the discipline of case documentation was, like the detective function itself, still in its formative stages. The potboy Jones, whose discovery of Eliza Davis's body opened the case to formal investigation, would in the ordinary course of events have been among the first witnesses questioned by the officers called to the scene. His account of the state in which he found the premises and the body forming a foundational element of the investigation's earliest hours. A potboy of this period occupied one of the more junior positions within a public house's staff, typically a young man or older boy responsible for carrying drink, cleaning vessels, and performing the general labour of the cellar and tap room, work that would have begun early in the day and brought him into the building at or around the same hour that Eliza Davis herself was accustomed to rise. His presence at the King's Arms on the morning of the 9th of May, and his discovery of what had occurred there, placed him at the very centre of the case's opening moments, even as the surviving record preserves little else of his own circumstances beyond the surname by which he's remembered in the one source that names him. What the potboy encountered on entering the cellar or taproom that morning is not described in sensory detail by any source consulted for this account, beyond the report of blood in a large quantity at the scene. Yet the practical realities of a cellar and taproom of this type allow some understanding of the space in which he made his discovery. Such rooms were customarily dim even in daylight, lit chiefly by whatever grey morning light reached through small windows set close to street level, with the deeper recesses of the cellar depending on a lamp or candle carried by whoever descended into it. A boy beginning his morning duties, expecting to find the premises already opened and prepared by the barmaid whose task that was, would have moved through these familiar rooms in the ordinary manner of 100 previous mornings, before encountering whatever caused him to raise the alarm. The shock of that discovery, on a morning otherwise indistinguishable from any other in the 7 or 8 years Eliza Davis had kept the house, is not recorded in his own words in any source available for this account, and this narrative does not attempt to supply an emotional account. The record itself does not provide. The alarm raised by the potboy would have brought the publican and any other members of the household to the scene within moments, and it was from this point that word of the killing began to spread beyond the walls of the King's Arms, first to the immediate neighbours on Brook Street and Frederick Street, and within hours to the police of the district, whose attendance at the scene marked the formal opening of the investigation that would occupy Inspector Aggs and Constable Pegler in the weeks that followed. News of a killing within a public house travelled quickly through a neighbourhood of this kind, where residents were accustomed to passing the King's Arms daily, and where Eliza Davis herself, esteemed for her civility across years of service, was a familiar figure to a great many of the district's inhabitants. It is this familiarity, this long-standing presence within the daily life of the surrounding streets, that lends the case its particular character among the investigations of the early Metropolitan Police. A woman, known personally to the very community whose members the investigating officers would spend the following weeks attempting to question. The formal investigation into the death of Eliza Davis was, in time, brought to a close without the identification of any individual whom the authorities were prepared to charge before a magistrate. This outcome, disappointing as it must have been to Inspector Aggs, to Constable Pegler, and to whatever members of the household and neighbourhood had cooperated with the inquiry in its opening weeks, was recorded within the surviving sources as the case's final disposition. No trial followed. No verdict of guilt was ever returned against any person in connection with her death. The limitations that prevented the case from advancing beyond investigation were in large measure the limitations of the era itself rather than of any particular failing on the part of Aggs or Pegler. A force 8 years into its existence, without a dedicated body of trained detectives, without any of the forensic techniques that would develop across the following decades, and without a systematic means of recording and cross-referencing criminal intelligence across the wider city, depended almost entirely on the willingness of ordinary residents to come forward with what they knew, and on the confession or betrayal of the guilty party by an associate. In the absence of either, a case such as this one, however energetically pursued in its opening days, was liable to remain exactly where the investigation into Eliza Davis's death ultimately remained. Its principal suspect never conclusively identified, its early leads exhausted without producing the single decisive fact that might have carried the matter before a magistrate. The officers assigned to the case would, in the ordinary course of their duties, have been required to turn their attention to fresh matters as new offences arose across the district and the wider metropolis. A demand on their time that the surviving record does not describe in relation to this specific case, but which was characteristic of policing throughout this period, when a small number of officers were required to cover an increasing population across an expanding city. Constable Pegler, whose experience assisting in the pursuit of James Greenacre had recommended him to this investigation, would in time have returned to the general duties of his station, the case of Eliza Davis becoming one among several serious matters he had assisted in during his early years of service, distinguished in the surviving record chiefly by its lack of the resolution that the Greenacre case, by contrast, had achieved. The King's Arms continued, so far as the record permits any inference, to operate as a public house on Brook Street in the years that followed, its trade resuming under the same proprietor who had employed Eliza Davis, the ordinary business of serving drink to the district's residents, and to whatever early custom continued to arrive at its door each morning. Whether that proprietor engaged a new barmaid to take up the duties Eliza Davis had performed for the better part of a decade, and whether the keys to the premises passed into the keeping of some other trusted servant of the household, is not recorded in any source consulted for this account. The absence of such detail is consistent with the broader pattern of this case's documentation, in which the woman at its centre and the violence that ended her life are recorded with some particularity, while the ordinary continuation of life around her, in the months and years that followed, passed without further note in the sources that survive. The trade of modeller, as it was practised by French and Italian craftsmen resident in London during this period, most commonly involved the making of figures in plaster or wax, sold or displayed for a variety of purposes, and it was a trade that brought a number of continental tradesmen to lodge in the cheaper districts of the city, moving from address to address as work and custom required. Such men were frequently unmarried, dependent on public houses and lodging houses for both their meals and their society, and it was in this capacity, as a customer of the King's Arms, rather than as a resident of the immediate neighbourhood in any more settled sense, that the man known in the surviving accounts as Entre would have come to be known to Eliza Davis across the course of her service behind the counter. The refusal of credit that the record attributes to her, and the words he is reported to have spoken in response, would not have been unusual in themselves. Disputes over the extension of drink on credit being a common feature of public house life throughout the period, ordinarily resolved without consequence beyond an aggrieved customer taking his custom elsewhere. It was only the violence that followed within the same premises, within so short a time of the reported exchange, that transformed an ordinary commercial disagreement into a matter of investigative suspicion. The spelling of the name Entre, as it survives in the sources consulted for this account, bears the marks of a name recorded phonetically by an English clerk or officer unfamiliar with its correct rendering, a common occurrence in the documentation of foreign tradesmen throughout this period, when parish and police records alike frequently preserved continental names in forms their bearers would scarcely have recognised. It is possible, though it cannot be established with any certainty from the sources available for this account, that the name, as it has come down through the historical record, differs from the name the man himself would have used. A further limitation among the several that already attend this case, what can be said with the confidence the surviving sources permit, is that a man of this trade and this reported name was traced and questioned in connection with the death of Eliza Davis, that suspicion gathered around him in the investigation's opening days, and that the reward notice issued on the 12th of May stood as an official statement working against the presumption, current in at least some of the London newspapers, that the guilty party was a foreign national at all. The reward notice's precise contradiction of the foreigner theory raises a further question. The surviving record does not resolve, namely what alternative description of the wanted man the investigating officers held in its place. A notice that specifies what a suspect was not, without a corresponding description of what he was believed to be, suggests either that the fuller description was considered unsuitable for public circulation at that stage of the inquiry, perhaps for fear of compromising a line of pursuit already underway, or that the officers possessed a firmer sense of who the man was not than of who he actually might be. Either possibility is consistent with an investigation still very much in progress, 3 days after the discovery of the body, working through multiple threads of suspicion without yet having settled upon one to the exclusion of the others. The French modeller Entree, whatever the outcome of the inquiries made concerning him, does not appear in the surviving sources as a man formally cleared of suspicion by any recorded statement, nor as a man ever charged. He belongs, in the record as it survives, to the category of persons traced and questioned without final resolution. One name among the several, the investigation is recorded in general terms as having pursued in the weeks following the 9th of May. The unnamed customer, whom the publican described as habitually arriving at the King's Arms around 6 o'clock in the morning, remains, within the surviving record, an even less resolved figure than the French modeller, a man never given a name, a trade, or any further identifying detail beyond the hour of his customary arrival, and the fact that this hour placed him in close proximity to the premises at very nearly the time Eliza Davis would have been engaged in unlocking them. The publican's decision to mention this customer to the investigating officers indicates that the coincidence of timing had struck him, in the aftermath of the murder, as worthy of note, though whether the officers who received this information were ever able to locate the man in question, to establish his movements on the morning in question, or to eliminate him from their inquiries, is not preserved in any source consulted for this account. He stands alongside Entree as one of the unresolved threads that the investigation into Eliza Davis's death left behind, a figure known only by the pattern of his habits and never identified by name in the surviving record. The investigation into the death of Eliza Davis was formally pursued for weeks and then, without further record of its progress, allowed to lapse. No suspect was ever charged. The identity of the person responsible was not established. None was ever formally sought after the initial weeks of inquiry. That is where the record of the second case ends. We turn now to the last of these 3 cases, further still from public memory than either of those that came before it, drawn from a different city and a different kind of neighbourhood entirely. It concerns a woman whose life before the night in question left almost no trace in any surviving document, and whose death was folded by contemporaries into a pattern of similar unsolved killings that unsettled a corner of London long before that city's name became associated with unsolved murder in the public mind. The case of Annie Yates begins in Bloomsbury, London, in March of 1884. Bloomsbury by that date was a district of tall Georgian terraced houses, built roughly a century earlier for a prosperous class of London resident and subdivided over the decades since into furnished lodgings let by the room or by the floor. The area sat within easy walking distance of three of the capital's principal railway termini, Euston, King's Cross and St Pancras, and this proximity gave the neighbourhood a transient population that moved through it in a constant, shifting stream. Lodging houses of every character stood along its streets and crescents, some respectable in every particular, others operating with considerably less formality, and a substantial number let rooms to women who supported themselves, wholly or in part, through prostitution. Burton Crescent itself, a curved terrace of similar houses a short distance from the Euston Road, had by 1884 already acquired an association with violent death, a fact that would shape the response to Annie Yates's killing before the investigation had properly begun. London, in the spring of 1884, was a city of some 4 million residents, governed in matters of policing by the Metropolitan Police, an institution by then more than 5 decades old, and organised into numbered divisions across the capital. The Euston Road, a broad and heavily trafficked thoroughfare running along the northern edge of Bloomsbury, was well known as a locus of street solicitation, particularly after dark, when women working in prostitution walked its length in search of custom, among travellers arriving at or departing from the railway stations nearby. Gaslighting illuminated the principal streets, though side streets and crescents remained considerably darker, and the pavements at night carried a mixture of pedestrians, cabmen, and public house patrons making their way home. It was into this environment, one of furnished rooms let by the week, of women working independently rather than under the direction of an organised house, and of a constant traffic of strangers passing through the district, that Annie Yates had recently arrived. Of Annie Yates's life before her residence at Burton Crescent, the surviving record establishes almost nothing. Her birthplace, her parents, and the circumstances of her upbringing are not established by any source consulted for this account. She was approximately 23 years of age at the time of her death, a fact recorded in contemporary accounts of the case, though the specific date and place of her birth are not established. In some records she is identified by the name Annie Yates, and in at least one other account she appears under the name Mary Ann Marshall, a variance that may reflect the common practice among women in her circumstances of using more than one name in the course of their working lives. This account uses Annie Yates as her name throughout, in keeping with the majority of sources and with her identification in the case itself, while noting that the alternate name exists in the record. At the time of her death, Annie Yates was renting a furnished room on the first floor at the rear of number 12 Burton Crescent in Bloomsbury. She had taken the room only approximately 3 weeks before the events that ended her life, a detail that suggests a recent change of address, though from where she had come and under what circumstances is not established by the surviving record. The room itself was of a type common throughout the district, a single furnished chamber let independently of any larger establishment, providing a woman in her position with a measure of privacy and independence not available in the more organised houses of the period. She supported herself, according to the record, through prostitution in a house that a modern account describes as essentially a brothel, housing several women in her circumstances who received clients in their own rented rooms. This was an entirely ordinary arrangement for a woman of her occupation in this part of London during this period, and it carried with it a vulnerability that the events of March 1884 would make evident, that of a woman alone in a private room, at night in the company of a man she did not previously know. If you find value in histories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now back to the record. On the night of the 8th of March, 1884, Annie Yates was seen alive for the last time at approximately midnight. She was observed on the Euston Road in the vicinity of Bloomsbury, in conversation with a man who was later described by witnesses in some detail. He was said to be approximately 25 years of age, of fair hair and fair complexion, of medium height, and respectable in his general appearance and manner of dress. Nothing in the surviving record identifies this man by name, occupation, or address, and the description given by those who observed him remains the only documented trace of his identity. In the ordinary pattern of the district and the hour, an encounter of this kind, on the Euston Road late at night, was consistent with the solicitation of a client, though the surviving accounts do not state this explicitly, and it is presented here as the context most consistent with the time, the place, and the manner of the encounter, rather than, as an established fact in its own right, what passed between Annie Yates and the man observed with her on the Euston Road, and where the two of them went after midnight, is not established by any surviving account. It is understood from the position in which she was later found, and from the general pattern of such encounters in the district, that she returned to her furnished room at 12 Burton Crescent, and that she was accompanied there, and the record does preserve some further trace of this. Lodgers in the house later stated they had heard her come in shortly before 2 o'clock, accompanied by a man, and that an unrepeated cry, like a scream, was heard from her room roughly an hour afterward. Beyond these fragments, the hours between midnight and the discovery of her body the following day remain undocumented in the surviving record, a gap common to cases of this kind in which a woman working alone received clients without the oversight or knowledge of any other person under the same roof. Annie Yates was found dead on Sunday, the 9th of March, 1884, between the hours of noon and 1 in the afternoon. She was discovered by a woman named Annie Ellis, who came to the room at Burton Crescent to check on her. The precise nature of the relationship between Annie Ellis and Annie Yates is not established by the surviving record, whether she was a neighbour within the same lodging house, a landlady with responsibility for the property, or an acquaintance from the same trade who had arranged to call on her that day. What the record does establish is that Annie Ellis's decision to look in on Annie Yates that Sunday led directly to the discovery of her body, and that Annie Ellis's own account of what she found, and of what she knew of Annie Yates's habits and condition, would become material to the investigation that followed. Annie Yates was found lying face down in her room, in a pool of blood, partly dressed. A towel lay across her face. The circumstances of the discovery, taken together with the position of the body and the presence of blood, indicated immediately to those who found her that she had not died of natural causes, and word was sent without delay to the police. The furnished room at 12 Burton Crescent, ordinary in every other respect, a modest first-floor chamber, let by the week to a woman supporting herself independently, had become the scene of a killing that would draw the attention of the Metropolitan Police, the coroner, and in time the London press, in a city already sensitive to the danger faced by women working alone in its lodging houses. The immediate response to the discovery of Annie Yates's body considered, in its earliest stage, the possibility that her death had resulted from an accident, specifically that she had fallen while in a state of intoxication and struck her head, rather than that she had been the victim of a deliberate act. This theory did not survive contact with the evidence gathered in the hours that followed. Annie Ellis, the woman who had discovered her, stated firmly that Annie Yates had been sober, contradicting any suggestion that drink had played a part in her death. This account, together with physical indications at the scene consistent with a struggle having taken place within the room, led those investigating to set aside the theory of accidental death and to proceed on the understanding that Annie Yates had been killed. Officers attached to the local division were dispatched to 12 Burton Crescent within a short time of the discovery being reported, and the room in which Annie Yates lay was examined before her body was removed. Statements were taken from those present in the house, beginning with Annie Ellis, whose account of the discovery and of Annie Yates's sober condition the previous evening formed the foundation of the case against the theory of accidental death. Other occupants of the lodging house were questioned in turn, though the surviving record does not preserve the substance of what they told investigating officers, nor does it establish how many other rooms in the building were let or to whom. The house itself, a converted terraced dwelling of the kind common throughout Bloomsbury, offered investigators a limited number of avenues, given that access to the first-floor back room was possible both from the main staircase used by all the lodgers, and depending on the layout common to such houses, from a rear entrance as well. Inquiry was made into the movements of Annie Yates on the evening before her death, and it was through this line of inquiry that the sighting on the Euston Road came to the attention of the police. Witnesses who had observed her in conversation with the fair-haired man shortly before midnight were traced and their descriptions of him recorded, descriptions that would remain, throughout the investigation and afterward, the only substantial lead as to the identity of the person who had been with her in the hours before her death. Officers made inquiries in the immediate vicinity of Burton Crescent and along the Euston Road itself, in an effort to establish whether the man in question was known to any other resident of the district or to any of the women who worked the same stretch of road. No identification of him is recorded as having resulted from these inquiries. The question of theft featured prominently in the investigation from an early stage. Money that Annie Yates was known or believed to have had in her possession was found to be missing from the room, and a ring she habitually wore was likewise gone. Investigators were left to weigh two possible explanations for this circumstance: that the removal of money and the ring had been the object of the encounter from the outset, or that these items had been taken as an afterthought once the killing had occurred. The surviving record does not resolve which of these explanations investigating officers favoured, nor does it indicate that any physical evidence recovered from the room pointed conclusively toward one interpretation over the other. The absence of any named suspect, either at this stage or subsequently, meant that the question of motive was never tested against the account of an accused party in a courtroom, and it remains, in the historical record, an open one. Word of the killing at Burton Crescent spread quickly through the surrounding streets, assisted by the address's existing association, in the minds of long-time residents and in the recollection of the local press, with her earlier death at another house on the same crescent some years before. This association was not lost on the newspapers that reported the case in the days following the discovery, several of which drew explicit comparison between the killing of Annie Yates and two earlier unsolved murders of women in the same general trade, one at a lodging house in Great Coram Street, a short distance away, the other at Euston Square, also within Bloomsbury. These comparisons, appearing within days of the discovery, reflected a genuine and immediate concern among contemporaries that women working independently in London's furnished lodging houses faced a danger that the authorities had proven unable to prevent or to resolve once it had occurred. The press did not establish, nor does the surviving record support, any factual connection between these earlier killings and the death of Annie Yates beyond the shared circumstance of the victim's occupation and the shared vulnerability of their working arrangements. The body of Annie Yates was conveyed for post-mortem examination to St Mary's Hospital, where the examination was conducted by Dr Paramore and Mr Pepper, both named in the surviving record as the physicians responsible for establishing the cause of death. Their examination determined that Annie Yates had received a blow, and that she had then been strangled, a towel found across her face believed by those who examined her to have been the means by which the strangulation was carried out. The post-mortem findings were consistent with a struggle having taken place within the room prior to her death, corroborating the account given by Annie Ellis and lending further support to the conclusion that the death had resulted from a deliberate act rather than from any accidental cause. Beyond establishing the cause of death and its consistency with a struggle, the physician's findings as preserved in the surviving record do not extend to further particulars, and no more precise estimate of the hour of death is recorded beyond the general window established by the midnight sighting and the discovery of the body the following afternoon. The proceedings that followed the post-mortem examination took the form standard to a sudden and violent death of this kind within the metropolis. A coroner's inquest convened to determine, from the evidence of witnesses and the findings of the medical examination, the cause and circumstances of death, and to return a formal verdict. A coroner's inquest of this period was conducted before a coroner and a jury drawn from the local district, sitting to hear testimony from those with knowledge of the deceased and the circumstances of her death, including, in a case such as this, the person who discovered the body and the physicians who conducted the post-mortem examination. The specific date on which the inquest into the death of Annie Yates was convened, the name of the presiding coroner, and the precise wording returned by the jury are not established by the surviving record consulted for this account. What can be stated with confidence, given the outcome of the case as a whole, is that no person was ever committed for trial in connection with her death, a fact consistent with an inquest verdict of willful murder against a person or persons unknown. The standard formula employed by coroners' juries of the period in cases where a death was found to have resulted from murder, but no individual could be named as responsible. No arrest followed the conclusion of the inquest, and the investigation, so far as the surviving record allows it to be traced, continued for a period without producing further result. Officers are understood to have maintained inquiries along the Euston Road and within the immediate district of Bloomsbury in the weeks that followed, in the hope that further sightings of the fair-haired man might come forward, or that the ring taken from Annie Yates might surface at a pawnbroker or dealer in the district, a common means by which stolen items of this kind were traced in the period. No record survives of either the ring or any item belonging to Annie Yates being recovered, and no witness beyond those who had already given their account of the Euston Road sighting is recorded as having come forward with further information. The passage of the weeks following the killing brought the investigation, gradually and without any formal announcement of its closure preserved in the surviving record, to the same point at which so many inquiries of this kind in this period concluded, an absence of any name to set against the crime. The room at 12 Burton Crescent was, in time, relet, in keeping with the ordinary economy of a lodging-house district in which a single address could pass through the hands of numerous tenants across the course of a few years, each largely unaware of what had taken place within its walls before their own arrival. Burton Crescent itself continued to function as it had before, a street of furnished lodgings within walking distance of the railway termini, its houses let by the room to a population that included, as it had for years prior, women working independently in the same trade as Annie Yates. The killing was not, in the years immediately following, understood by contemporaries to have altered the character or the reputation of the street in any decisive way, in part because the street had already carried an association with unsolved violent death before Annie Yates ever took her room there, an association that her killing served to deepen rather than to originate. The case of Annie Yates survives in the historical record chiefly through its inclusion within a broader modern study of London's unsolved murders of women in the years surrounding and preceding the killings in Whitechapel that would occur 4 years later in 1888. The historian Jan Bonderson, in a study titled Rivals of the Ripper, examines the killing of Annie Yates, alongside a number of other unresolved cases from the same period and the same general district of London, presenting her death as part of a pattern of violence against women working in prostitution within the capital's furnished lodging houses that predated and, in some respects, prefigured the killings that would later dominate public memory of Victorian London. This modern scholarly treatment represents the principal means by which the case has been preserved and examined in the century and more since it occurred, alongside more recent treatment on specialist sites devoted to the history of London's unsolved crimes, which continue to group her death together with other killings of women in the same trade and the same era as part of a loose thematic study of a pattern that troubled contemporaries without ever being resolved by them. The broader context in which Annie Yates lived and died was one shaped by the particular conditions of London's furnished lodging house trade in the final decades of the 19th century. A woman in her position, working independently rather than under the direction of an organised house, rented her own room by the week, retained a measure of independence not available to women attached to a more structured establishment, and bore, in consequence, a corresponding measure of risk that the structure of an organised house might otherwise have mitigated. She answered to no proprietor who might have overseen who came and went from her room, kept no record of her clients beyond whatever she carried in her own memory, and relied, in the ordinary course of her working life, on her own judgment of the men she brought back to Burton Crescent. This was not a circumstance unique to Annie Yates. It was the ordinary condition of a great many women who supported themselves, in this manner, across London's Bloomsbury, King's Cross, and Euston Road districts in this period, a condition that made the district, in the assessment of contemporaries reporting on her death and the earlier killings they associated with it, a place of particular and recurring danger for women in her circumstances. The rents commanded by furnished rooms of the type Annie Yates occupied in Bloomsbury during this period were modest by the standards of the wealthier districts of London, typically a matter of a few shillings a week, payable to a landlord or landlady who in many cases occupied rooms elsewhere in the same building and exercised only limited oversight of the comings and goings of individual tenants. This arrangement suited women in Annie Yates's circumstances precisely because it demanded so little of them beyond the payment of rent, allowing them to conduct their working lives with a degree of privacy that a more supervised establishment would not have permitted. It also meant that a woman new to a street, as Annie Yates was to Burton Crescent, having taken her room only some 3 weeks before her death, would have been largely unknown to her neighbours, her habits and her associations unfamiliar to those who might otherwise have noticed anything amiss in the days or hours before she died. The Euston Road itself, along which Annie Yates was last seen alive, carried through the evening and into the night a steady traffic, drawn from the railway termini that lined its length. Travellers, arriving from the provinces, cab drivers waiting on custom, and porters and other railway employees moving between shifts, alongside the women who worked the pavements in search of clients among this passing population. Public houses, situated at intervals along the road, provided a further source of custom, particularly in the hours after they closed, when patrons made their way home along streets lit by gas lamps, spaced at intervals sufficient to illuminate the principal thoroughfare, while leaving the side streets and crescents leading off it considerably darker. It was from this environment of arriving trains, closing public houses, and gas-lit pavements that the fair-haired man who spoke with Annie Yates shortly before midnight is understood to have emerged, one figure among the many who passed along the Euston Road that night, indistinguishable in the moment from any other respectable-looking stranger, and in the end no more identifiable after the fact than he had been in passing. Policing of this stretch of London in 1884 fell to constables of the Metropolitan Police walking fixed beats through the district, supplemented by plainclothes officers attached to the local division in cases warranting closer investigation. A constable on a beat covering Burton Crescent and the surrounding streets would have passed the house at 12 Burton Crescent multiple times in the course of a single night's duty, a routine of patrol that offered no particular protection to a woman once she had brought a client back to her own furnished room, beyond whatever general deterrent effect the visible presence of the police exercised on the street itself. This was the ordinary limit of protection available to a woman in Annie Yates's position in this period, a police presence sufficient to patrol the public street, but powerless to extend into the privacy of a rented room once its door was closed, a limit that the events of the 8th and 9th of March 1884 made evident in the starkest possible terms. Descriptions of the fair-haired man observed with Annie Yates on the Euston Road were circulated by the police in the days following the discovery of her body, a standard measure in cases of this kind by which officers sought to draw upon the observations of the wider public rather than relying solely upon the witnesses already traced. Such circulars, printed and distributed to other divisions of the Metropolitan Police, and in some cases reproduced in the newspapers reporting the case, carried the particulars already gathered: his approximate age, his fair hair and complexion, his medium height, and the respectable character of his dress and bearing, in the hope that some other resident of the district, some other woman working the same stretch of road, or some acquaintance of his own, might recognise the description and come forward. No record survives of any such identification resulting from this circulation, and the description that had been gathered from those who observed him on the night of the 8th of March remained, in the weeks and months that followed, the only means by which he might have been traced. The newspapers of the day gave the killing of Annie Yates a measure of attention consistent with the pattern already noted, one shaped in large part by the memory of the earlier unsolved killing at Great Coram Street. That earlier case, occurring some 12 years before in 1872, had concerned a woman named Harriet Buswell, who worked in prostitution and was found murdered in a lodging-house room at number 12 Great Coram Street, a short distance from Burton Crescent, in circumstances that, in certain particulars, resembled those of Annie Yates's death. A woman working independently, a rented room, a client received a loan, and never subsequently identified with sufficient certainty to secure a conviction. That case, too, had ended without any person being convicted, despite an investigation that had, at one stage, detained a foreign national as a suspect before the case against him collapsed for want of sufficient evidence. The recollection of this earlier failure, still current in the memory of the district and its press 12 years on, coloured the reporting of Annie Yates's death from its earliest days, framing it not as an isolated event, but as the latest instance of a danger that the authorities had already once failed to resolve. A further case, occurring at Euston Square in Bloomsbury, was likewise drawn into the newspaper's treatment of Annie Yates's death, cited alongside the Great Coram Street killing as evidence of a broader and troubling pattern affecting women in her trade across this part of London. The particulars of the Euston Square case beyond its citation in connection with Annie Yates's death are not established by the surviving record consulted for this account, and no source reviewed here asserts any factual link between that killing, the death of Harriet Buswell 12 years before, and the death of Annie Yates in March of 1884, beyond the shared circumstance of the victim's occupation and the shared failure of each investigation to identify a perpetrator. Contemporaries nonetheless drew the comparison freely, and the effect of that comparison, appearing across multiple newspapers within days of Annie Yates's death, was to lend her case a resonance beyond its own particulars, situating it within a pattern of violence against women working alone in London's furnished lodging houses that predated her death by more than a decade, and would continue to trouble the capital in the years that followed. The pattern that contemporaries had already begun to draw around Annie Yates's death, of women working alone in prostitution, killed within furnished lodging-house rooms, and their killers never identified, would recur again within the same general district of London only 4 years later, in the autumn of 1888, in a series of murders that would come to dominate public memory of Victorian crime in a way that Annie Yates's own case never did. No source consulted for this account establishes any factual connection between the killing of Annie Yates in March of 1884 and the murders that followed later in the decade, and none is asserted here. What can be said is that the pattern of vulnerability that contemporaries identified in the aftermath of her death, a woman working independently, a rented room, a client received without oversight or record, was one that persisted in this part of London through the remainder of the decade, and that the failure to resolve her case coming as it did after the earlier failure to resolve the killing of Harriet Buswell, left behind it a documented sense among those reporting on London's crime in this period that the danger faced by women in this trade had not been addressed by any measure the authorities had yet taken. No memorial marks the site of Annie Yates's death, and no plaque or public record beyond the case file. The newspaper accounts of March 1884 and the later scholarly treatment of her case preserves her name in any place accessible to a passer-by walking the length of what was once Burton Crescent. The street itself was renamed in the years that followed, becoming known by a different name entirely, a change of address that has been associated in accounts of the district's history with the accumulation of violent and unresolved deaths that had occurred along its length over the preceding decades, though this renaming pertains to the street's broader history rather than to Annie Yates's case in particular. And other killings at other addresses along the same crescent contributed to that history independently of her own. What remains most directly of Annie Yates's case, beyond the renaming of the street on which she died, is the documentary record itself. The newspaper columns of March 1884, the post-mortem findings of Dr. Paramore and Mr. Pepper, and the later scholarly attention of historians examining London's unresolved killings of women in this period, chief among them the study that placed her death alongside a small number of comparable and equally unresolved cases from the same city and the same years. The investigation into the death of Annie Yates, considered as a whole, proceeded through each of the stages ordinarily followed in a case of suspected murder within the metropolis. The dispatch of officers to the scene, the taking of statements from those present in the house, the tracing and questioning of witnesses who had observed her in the hours before her death, the post-mortem examination conducted by named physicians at a recognised hospital, and the convening of a coroner's inquest to receive the evidence gathered and to return a formal verdict. At no stage of this process, so far as the surviving record establishes, did the investigation produce a named suspect against whom sufficient evidence could be gathered to justify an arrest or a committal for trial. The description of the fair-haired man observed with her on the Euston Road remained, from the earliest days of the investigation to its eventual and undocumented conclusion, the only substantial thread the police possessed, and it proved in the end insufficient to lead to his identification. In the weeks that followed the inquest, several of the London newspapers that had reported the original discovery returned to the case in brief follow-up notices, observing that no arrest had yet been made and that the police appeared no closer to identifying the man last seen in Annie Yates's company than they had been in the first days of the investigation. This pattern of periodic return to an unresolved case was common in the London press of the period, a means by which papers maintained public interest in a killing that continued to lack resolution, while also serving in its way as a form of pressure upon the police to demonstrate that an investigation had not simply lapsed for want of further efforts. No notice of this kind, so far as the surviving record establishes, ever announced a breakthrough in the case of Annie Yates. Each repeated the same substance as the last, that inquiries continued, that the description of the fair-haired man remained the principal lead, and that no person had yet been charged. The coroner's jury that heard the evidence in the matter of Annie Yates's death would have been drawn, in keeping with the ordinary practice of the period, from among the ratepayers and tradesmen resident within the district in which the death occurred, men summoned to serve without payment beyond a nominal fee, and required, before hearing testimony, to view the body of the deceased as part of their sworn duty. This requirement, standard to English coronial procedure throughout the Victorian period, placed upon the jurors of Annie Yates's inquest the same obligation borne by juries in inquests across the country, to satisfy themselves directly of the fact and apparent manner of death before receiving the testimony of witnesses such as Annie Ellis and the physicians who had examined her. The jury's eventual verdict, once testimony had been heard and the coroner had summed up the evidence for their consideration, would have been returned in open court, a formal pronouncement that closed the inquest itself while leaving the broader criminal investigation, and the identity of the man responsible entirely unresolved. Annie Ellis's testimony, in the context of this proceeding, carried a particular weight beyond its immediate evidentiary purpose. Her insistence that Annie Yates had been sober on the night of her death stood as the single piece of testimony that displaced the earliest and simplest explanation offered for what had been found, that of a woman who had fallen under the influence of drink and struck her head by accident. Had Annie Ellis's account gone otherwise, or had she not been in a position to speak with confidence to Annie Yates's condition, that evening the case might have concluded far more quickly, recorded as a domestic accident rather than pursued as a killing. It was her testimony, together with the physical evidence of a struggle noted at the scene, that redirected the case onto the course it in fact followed, an investigation into a murder rather than an inquiry into a fall. And it is on the strength of that redirection that the case survives in the record at all as one of London's unsolved killings of women in this trade during this period, rather than as a closed and unremarkable file recording an accidental death. The process by which a case such as Annie Yates's is reconstructed in the present day relies upon the survival of a narrow range of documentary sources, chiefly the contemporary newspaper reports published in the days and weeks following her death, the surviving fragments of the coroner's record where they have been preserved, and hospital or police registers noting the post-mortem examination and its findings. Many cases from this period, particularly those concerning victims whose occupation placed them outside the more thoroughly documented classes of Victorian society, survive today only through such newspaper accounts, the original police files and inquest papers having, in many instances, been lost, destroyed, or never systematically preserved in the first instance. This is the general condition affecting the historical record for women of Annie Yates's circumstances throughout the period, and it accounts in large part for the significant gaps that remain in her case. Her life before Burton Crescent, the relationship between herself and Annie Ellis, and the ultimate fate of the investigation once it passed beyond the point at which the newspapers ceased to report on it. The modern study that situates Annie Yates's death among a small number of comparable cases takes as its subject precisely this category of unresolved killing. Women working in prostitution in London's furnished lodging houses during the years before and immediately following the killings that would later dominate public memory of the city's crime. Such a study proceeds, case by case, drawing together the surviving newspaper accounts, inquest records where available, and any subsequent scholarly or journalistic treatment in an effort to reconstruct as complete an account as the surviving documentation permits, while acknowledging in each instance the limits of what can be established with confidence. Annie Yates's case within such a study occupies a modest place, one among several comparable killings from the same city and the same general period, each sharing the common feature of a victim working independently in prostitution, a death occurring within a rented room, and an investigation that identified at best a partial description of a possible perpetrator before concluding without an arrest. This placement within a broader study of comparable cases represents the principal form in which Annie Yates's death has been examined by later generations, distinct from the sustained popular and scholarly attention given to other unsolved killings of women in London during the final decades of the 19th century. No dedicated book-length treatment of her case alone is known to survive or to have been produced, and no dramatisation, ballad, or work of popular fiction is documented as having taken her death as its specific subject, in contrast to certain other cases from the same city and period that achieved a far wider cultural currency. Her case remains, in the fullest sense available to the present-day record, a documented but largely unremembered entry in the history of London's unresolved violence against women of her trade, preserved through the diligence of specialist historians rather than through any wider popular memory. The legal position of a woman such as Annie Yates working independently in prostitution within the metropolis in 1884 was shaped in part by legislation that had governed women in her trade for over 2 decades by that date, permitting in certain garrison and port towns, though not within London itself, the compulsory medical examination of women suspected of prostitution under provisions that campaigners of the period had long argued subjected women to a form of legal scrutiny and physical intrusion not imposed upon the men who purchased their services. Though these particular provisions did not extend to London, the broader legal and social framework they represented, one in which a woman's occupation as a prostitute placed her outside the ordinary protections and considerations extended to other classes of Victorian women, shaped the manner in which cases such as Annie Yates's death were investigated, reported, and ultimately allowed to lapse without resolution. A killing of this kind, involving a victim of her occupation, did not command the same sustained institutional urgency that a comparable killing of a woman outside her trade might have commanded, a disparity acknowledged implicitly in the newspaper's own framing of her death, as one instance within a recurring and largely unaddressed pattern, rather than as an isolated outrage demanding singular attention. This legal and social context does not appear in the surviving record as a stated factor in the conduct of the investigation into Annie Yates's death, and no source consulted for this account asserts that officers or the coroner treated her case with less rigour on account of her occupation. What the surviving record does establish is the outcome itself, an investigation that followed the standard procedural course, from the dispatch of officers to the scene through to the return of an inquest verdict, and that nonetheless concluded without an arrest, a fact consistent with, though not proven to be caused by, the broader pattern of unresolved killings affecting women of her trade in this district across more than a decade. The description of the fair-haired man observed with her on the Euston Road on the night of the 8th of March, 1884, remains in the surviving documentary record the closest the investigation ever came to identifying the person responsible for her death, and it is a description that was never matched to a name. The formal record of the investigation into Annie Yates's death, once compiled, would have been retained among the papers of the division responsible for the district in which Burton Crescent stood, filed alongside the inquest papers and the post-mortem findings of Dr. Paramore and Mr. Pepper as the permanent documentary trace of a case that had reached no further resolution. Such files, in the ordinary practice of the Metropolitan Police during this period, were not destroyed upon the conclusion of an unsuccessful investigation, but retained indefinitely, available for consultation should any later development, a chance confession, the recovery of the missing ring, or a fresh sighting of a man matching the description gathered on the Euston Road, warrant the case being reopened. No surviving record indicates that any such development ever occurred in the years that followed, and the file, so far as can be established from the sources available, remained exactly as it had been left at the conclusion of the original inquiry, a description without a name attached to it, a death without a person held to account. The description of the fair-haired man remained, across the years that followed, the single thread by which the case might, in principle, have been resolved, had it ever been matched to an individual. It named no one. It placed no one at 12 Burton Crescent beyond the account of witnesses who had seen a stranger speaking with Annie Yates shortly before midnight, a man of ordinary and respectable appearance, indistinguishable in the moment from countless others passing along the Euston Road that night, and undistinguished in the end by anything beyond the fact that a woman who spoke with him was never seen alive again. Annie Ellis, for her part, is not recorded in the surviving sources as having played any further role in the case once her testimony had been given and the inquest concluded. She appears in the record at 2 points only, As the woman who came to Burton Crescent that Sunday afternoon and found what had been done, and as the witness whose account of Annie Yates's sober condition the night before turned the case from a presumed accident into an acknowledged murder. Beyond these two moments, nothing further is recorded of her. No address, no occupation stated with certainty, no account of what she made, in the years that followed, of having been the one to find her acquaintance dead, and the one whose word had insisted on the truth of what had happened over the easier explanation that lay closest to hand. Her insistence stands in the record as the single act among all those connected to the case that changed its course, a plain refusal to allow a convenient account to stand unchallenged, offered by a woman whose own name would otherwise have left no trace in the history of Burton Crescent at all. In the weeks following the killing, other women working the same stretch of the Euston Road and the surrounding streets of Bloomsbury are understood, from the general pattern described in contemporary press accounts of the period's reaction to such cases, to have exercised greater caution than before in the clients they agreed to receive, some declining to bring a stranger back to a room at all unless he were already known to them, others arranging to work within sight or hearing of a neighbour rather than entirely alone. This shift in practice, common to the aftermath of any unresolved killing within a district where women of the same trade continued to work, reflected an understanding among those most exposed to the same risk that no arrest had been made, that the man responsible for Annie Yates's death remained unidentified and at large, and that the ordinary precautions available to them, precautions that had not saved Annie Yates herself, were the only protection any of them could rely upon. The surviving record does not indicate how long such heightened caution persisted, nor whether it altered in any lasting way the pattern of solicitation and lodging that had characterised the Euston Road and Burton Crescent before her death. The case, as it stood at the close of the formal investigation, offered no comfort to those who had known Annie Yates, however slightly, and no resolution to the newspapers that had reported her death alongside the earlier killings at Great Coram Street and Euston Square. It offered instead a single description, a missing ring, a towel, and the plain, unchallenged testimony of one woman who had refused to let a false explanation stand. That towel found across her face when Annie Ellis entered the room that Sunday afternoon was the detail that lodged most firmly in the accounts written of the case afterward, a plain domestic object turned in the space of one night into the instrument by which a woman's life had been taken. It was not unusual in itself, the ordinary furnishing of any furnished room in Bloomsbury, present in hundreds of similar chambers along Burton Crescent and the streets around it, kept for washing, for drying, for the small daily purposes of a room let by the week. Its presence across Annie Yates's face when she was found gave the physicians who examined her, Dr. Paramore and Mr. Pepper, the means by which they determined the manner of her death, and it gave the newspapers reporting the case a single, concrete image around which the whole of an otherwise undocumented night could be organised, a detail small enough to be stated plainly and final enough to require no further embellishment. Nothing recovered from the room, and nothing gathered in the course of the investigation that followed, ever supplied a name to set beside that detail. The ring was never traced, the money was never recovered. The man seen with her shortly before midnight on the Euston Road was never brought forward, by witness or by his own admission, to answer for what had happened in the hours after that sighting. What remained when the newspapers stopped returning to the case, and the file was set down among the records of investigations that had reached no conclusion, was the towel, the testimony of one woman who had insisted on the truth of what she had seen, and a description that fit a great many men and identified none of them. The case of Annie Yates was the last of these three cases to enter the historical record. No arrest was ever made. The identity of the perpetrator was not established. No conviction followed. None was ever sought,